So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Pollination Celebration, an opportunity to connect our food system, our environment, and our community, hosted by University of Illinois Extension and the Illinois Farmers Market Association. My name is Lori George, and I am an educator at the University of Illinois Extension. I will be your host for today. We appreciate you joining us, and we will do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. Questions can be added to the chat box and will be answered at the end of the presentation. So today we have a speaker, Amanda Pankau. She is the market manager for the Monticello Farmers Market and is an energy campaign coordinator with Prairie Rivers Network. The Monticello Farmers Market is a program of Monticello Main Street in downtown Monticello. Amanda's interest in local food systems stems from her education in ecology and understanding of the impacts an industrial agriculture had on our land, water, and wildlife. In addition to benefiting our lands and waters, she also appreciates how local, sustainable food systems can help our small communities and our rural economies. She enjoys running, keeping chickens, gardening, and sharing lessons on rivers and local food with her two young sons. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you for the introduction, Lori. I'm really pleased to be here today to share information about two of my favorite things, pollinators and farmers markets. Specifically, my presentation is a pollination celebration, an opportunity to connect our environment, our food system, and our community. So before we get started and dive in, I'd like to give an overview of my presentation. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll discuss how humans, pollinators, and our agriculture food system all fit into a larger ecological system. We'll talk about what pollinators are, why they're important, and how their population declines may be sending us a message about the health of this ecological system. We'll talk about what we can do to raise awareness and help pollinators, and in particular, I'll share the story of the Monticello Farmers Market's efforts to do this through our annual pollination celebration. So Lori already kind of gave an introduction to myself, so most of this is just a review. I like to put it up here. I love small world stories, so I like to kind of share where I've been, what I've done, in hopes that there's connections with other people. So I grew up in Monticello along the Sangamon River, growing up along the river, and also with my father, who was a soil scientist. I developed both a love of nature and a love of our rich soils and the agriculture we have here in the state. So I have 2 degrees in ecology, spent a lot of time living in Southern Illinois, first got involved with local food systems through volunteer and board service with the nonprofit FoodWorks. This nonprofit's somewhat similar to the Land Connection, a little bit different though. It does a farmers network, new farmer training, and also runs an indoor farmers market in Carbondale. Moved back up north to Monticello in 2017, and that's when I started helping with the farmers market that fall, eventually taking over for the longtime manager at the beginning of the 2018 season. And then my day job, I work for Prairie Rivers Network, which is an environmental nonprofit, statewide organization based out of Champaign-Urbana. And in that capacity, I work on our energy and climate campaign. So a little bit about Monticello. So the farmers market is actually a program of Monticello Main Street, and this is a nonprofit organization dedicated to historic preservation and revitalization of Monticello's downtown area. So before I talk about our farmers market, I did want to just give folks grounding in where Monticello is and a little bit about that community. So it's located in East Central Illinois along I-72. It has a population about 5,500. And I did want to share what I view as some of the exciting things about our community. We have a historic downtown area. The picture on the bottom left is our courthouse, and the square around that has a lot of shopping and eating opportunities. We have a historic railway museum that's really cool. You can go ride and check out old diesel and steam trains. This time of year, they have a Polar Express event that's very popular. couple other jewels of our community include Allerton Park and Retreat Center, which is a mansion and natural areas owned and maintained by the University of Illinois, as well as our Sangamon River, which flows through the county, also flowing through Allerton Park. So obviously another big jewel of our community is our farmers market. It's located outside what used to be the old library and is now a community building. And so we have access to that building and bathrooms. The street is shaded. The market runs mid-June to mid-October, Thursday afternoons from 3:30 to 6:30 p.m. And just this year, 2019, we actually celebrated 20 years of the Monticello Farmers Market. And so as a new manager, a question I have is, we've made it 20 years. Is our market sustainable for another 20 years? How about another 50 to 100 years? And then as an ecologist, I think more broadly, and I ask the question, is our agriculture system sustainable for another 20 years, another 50, another 100? So that word sustainable that I just used, it's a buzzword, but what does it actually mean? So just at its simplest point, it means that we're meeting the needs of the present while leaving equal and better opportunities for the future. So you don't need to read this quote here. I'll kind of run through it, but it's a quote from Dr. John Eichard, who's a professor emeritus of agriculture economics at the University of Missouri. I'm a big fan of his. He teaches and writes about local food systems, farmers markets, and sustainable agriculture as a whole. And I share this quote just at the beginning of the talk to kind of ground us in a broader thinking as I start to talk about pollinators and what's happening to them. I want us to be thinking about how that all fits together in this larger system. So the quote says, "By nature, organisms come to life, they grow to maturity, reproduce and die, their bodies to be consumed by other living organisms or recycled to support a future generation of life." So this part of the quote is describing an ecological balance, our ecosystems. What you might simply call the circle of life. And we, of course, are part of this. And as we'll talk about more later, pollinators play a very important role in this functioning ecosystem, this circle of life. So the next part of the quote, agriculture attempts to tip this ecological balance in favor of humans relative to other species. If we tip this balance too far and too fast, we destroy the integrity of the natural system of which we are a part. A sustainable agriculture must be in harmony with nature. So in other words, in order to be sustainable, agriculture must conserve and protect the natural resources. This includes the land, the soil, the water and animals, and the pollinators upon which it all ultimately depends. So let's take a look at where we've been when it comes to our agriculture, our food system in Illinois, and where we are with our land use and agricultural system today. So these two maps, the one on the left is our Illinois land cover in the early 1800s, and then the map on the right is present day. So in the early 1800s, the green is forest and the tan color is prairie. Between this time and modern day, we actually lost 99.9% of our prairie habitat, our original prairie habitat. And the yellow, you know, what the prairie and much of the forest became agriculture. So just looking at this, it's a pretty stark contrast. So we can ask the question, what have we done something that is sustainable, or are we tipping the balance too far? And this brings us now to how pollinators fit into this balance and how they might be sending us a message about this current system. So before we talk about pollinators and what's happening to their populations, I wanted to take another step back and just talk about what pollination is. So it's the act of moving pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma, and pollination results in the formation of seeds. In some plants, this happens primarily or completely by wind. So many grasses are wind pollinated. The wind is moving that pollen. But in many situations, situations, plants need a little help with pollination, and that help comes from animals, primarily insects, and those animals are known as pollinators. So this process is mutually beneficial to both the plants and the pollinators. As I mentioned, the pollination results in the production of seeds and is necessary for many plants to reproduce. Meanwhile, the pollinators receive nectar and pollen rewards from the flowers that they visit. So that nectar is providing pollinators with carbohydrates, while the pollen offers proteins, fats, and vitamins and minerals. And another thing that is really interesting, and we could have a whole presentation about, is the unique partnership between specific pollinators and specific plants. In many cases, one can't exist without the other. Should one disappear, the other would be just a generation away from disaster. So we often think of honeybees as our main pollinator, and that's true. They do play a very large role in pollination, but it's interesting to note that honeybees aren't actually native to the United States, although they are naturalized, living in both managed and unmanaged colonies. There are actually 400 to 500 species of native bees in Illinois, and these are all important to both agriculture and natural systems. Other pollinators include things like ants, butterflies, moths, beetles, and there are even some non-insect pollinators, including things like hummingbirds and bats. So why are pollinators important? Why are they worth celebrating, as we're talking about today? So about 35% of the world's food crops depend on animal pollinators to reproduce. There's a widely stated phrase in agriculture that you can thank a pollinator for 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat. So some crops that are dependent on animal pollinators include things like almonds, strawberries, apples, melons, squash, avocados, and more. We'll talk about later that actually coffee and chocolate are both crops that are dependent on pollinators. So for many people, if you weren't listening, now you are, because I know I personally am a big coffee drinker, and so that gets my attention. Let's see. So other crops, they might not be completely reliant on pollination, or on animal pollinators, but they are greatly improved by animal pollination. So 2 good examples of that are strawberries and raspberries. So the pictures shown here at the top show insect pollinated strawberries and raspberries, and these are what you think of as your market ready fruits. Obviously, the self-pollinated and wind-pollinated ones are something that is not marketable. So although yes, a seed might form, this isn't something that's going to be, brought to the market or used for human consumption. Honeybees are a pretty obvious example of why pollinators are important. Honey is simply a byproduct of pollination. It's used commercially for food, skin creams, anti-aging lotions, and medicinal purposes. Beeswax and pollen are both produced by honeybees and are used in lip balm and other cosmetic products. And then propolis is another product. It's a resinous sealant that's created by bees and is used commercially. So if I could sum this slide up in one sentence, it would be that healthy pollinators are needed for healthy ecosystems. So obviously the importance of pollinators to our agricultural systems is very important, but this is talking about the importance of agriculture, or of pollinators, to that ecosystem balance, or that circle of life that I talked about. So outside of agricultural systems, more than 80% of the plant species found in natural habitats require animal pollination. And we know that plants are the foundation of terrestrial food chains. Their foliage and their fruits and nuts are eaten by herbivores, which are then in turn hunted by predators, and those plants that provide shelter and nesting habitat for animal species. So we know that in order to maintain the diversity of our natural ecosystems, we need healthy pollinator populations to ensure that the next generation of plants will be produced. So natural systems, like the role that pollinators play, provide something called ecosystem services, many of which humans depend on. But despite their importance, these ecosystem services usually don't have a monetary or economic value assigned to them, and therefore they're often taken for granted. Because of this, scientists and economists often try to find ways to estimate and apply a monetary value to these services so that we can better understand how important they are. So I found a few studies that estimated the value of pollinators. This first one is looking at the agricultural system. Pollinators contribute more than $24 billion to the US economy through their vital role in keeping fruits, nuts, and vegetables in our diet. Of that 24 billion, honeybees are accounting for over half of it at $15 billion. And then this second study actually looked at wild insects, so this did not include managed honeybees, and it looked at not only pollination, but also other services that insects are providing, things like decomposition, pest control, and wildlife nutrition. And this study determined that those wild insects provide an annual value of at least $57 billion in the United States. So these are some fun pictures I found that show what would our plates look like without pollinators. So this is a basic breakfast, and in addition to making honey, bees pollinate crops like, as I mentioned, berries and almonds. So our bowl of fruit there is now empty. You'll notice our milk is not in the cereal, and that's because animal pollinators play an important role in alfalfa, and a lot of our dairy cows rely on that. I already mentioned that coffee is reliant on animal pollination, so our coffee cup there is empty as well. And then what would our dinner plates look like? Bumblebees increase tomato and pepper yields, especially in greenhouses. So we're missing some of our vegetables there. Similarly, zucchini, squash, cucumbers, avocados rely on animal pollinators. So our dinner plate would be much less colorful without pollinators. And finally, we can ask the question, what would our farmers markets look like without pollinators? We have, very colorful, very diverse offerings at our farmers markets in Illinois. Most of everything in these pictures are reliant on animal pollinators. And so, I'll note that without pollinators, we wouldn't just completely lose everything, but the impacts to having to increase our agricultural land base, and then the impacts on the economics, having to pay for more manual pollination and things would just completely turn things on their head. So I mentioned that the value of pollinators is not given a monetary value, and I would argue that we often take their role for granted. But there's a growing need to change that line of thinking, because we're finding that pollinator populations are declining, and it's time that we better understood why they're declining and what we can do to help them. So this slide shows some of the changes in managed honeybee populations. So we don't have a lot of data and a lot of information on wild bees, just because they're not very well studied, but we have a lot of information on managed bee populations because the beekeepers are keeping track of all of this. So during the period from 1947 to 2005, we saw the number of managed bee colonies shrink by 60%. So this graph actually stops at 2007. This is kind of the best graph I could find, and unfortunately it's a little bit old. But I did look at the data of what has been happening to populations recently, and their numbers have been increasing since then. But that's actually likely due to better management and replacement of hives. As beekeepers are trying to tackle this problem, it's not because we're seeing fewer deaths of bees. And we know that because we can look at some other data. So the graph on the right there shows our annual overwintering losses of bees between 2003 and 2013. So historically, the overwintering loss rates were at 10 to 15%. And in recent years, we're seeing losses between 25 and 60%. And again, this graph at the bottom right is also a little bit old, and but I did look at the more recent numbers. And so in the winter of 2018 to 2019, we saw one of the biggest honeybee die-offs in the US on record, with 37% of managed honeybee colonies lost last winter. And also, unfortunately, Illinois happens to be one of the top states in annual losses. We lost 60% of honeybee colonies last year. So the studies that I reviewed talked about the recent losses as being caused by a combination of stressors, so including the loss of natural forage and inadequate diets, mite infestations and other diseases, loss of genetic diversity, and exposure to certain pesticides. Also contributing to the high loss rate is a phenomenon known as colony collapse disorder. It was first kind of identified around 2006, 2007, and it's just a phenomenon that I guess defines a rapid, unexpected and catastrophic loss of bees in a hive. And it's again thought to be due to a variety of factors, but it's just causing major losses in honeybee colonies. So I mentioned we don't have a lot of data on native bee species, but in 2017, we did see the first comprehensive review of more than 4,000 native bee species published by the Center of Biological Diversity. This report was entitled Pollinators in Peril, a Systematic Status Review of North American and Hawaiian Native Bees. So of those 4,000 bees, not all of them had enough data to review. So of the 1,400 that did have enough data, they found that more than half of them are declining, and that nearly 1 in 4 of native bee species are at increasing risk of extinction. And even the bees that did lack sufficient data, there was evidence that they were also at risk of, they were declining or at risk of extinction. The declines listed in this report included the primary causes of habitat loss, heavy pesticide use, climate change, and urbanization. And then the other picture I have up here is of the cute little rusty patched bumblebee, and this is actually the very first ever federally listed endangered bee species, just listed in the last year or two. So another pollinator that has faced population decline is the monarch butterfly. And so while this insect isn't considered a commercially important pollinator, it's definitely culturally important. And to understand its decline and how we might help it, we must first understand the life cycle of the monarch butterfly a bit better. So I thought we'd just take a second to review the metamorphosis and kind of life history of the monarch butterfly that, you know, hopefully a lot of folks are already aware of because it's becoming such a popular species. So the eggs of this butterfly are laid on different species of milkweed, and the reason for that is that milkweed is the only plant that the caterpillar can eat. So the caterpillar hatches, it's very small, you can hardly even see it when it first hatches. It starts eating, and that's its job, is to eat milkweed, and it grows and it sheds its skin 3 different times, going through different stages called instars. And then it pupates, forming its chrysalis, and then obviously an adult monarch butterfly emerges. So the other interesting thing to note about these creatures is that they're migrating insects. Some monarch butterflies migrate up to 3,000 miles. And I'm speaking about the eastern population that we find here in Illinois in the late spring to early fall. And these butterflies are here that time of year, and then they spend the winter in Mexico. And it's in very limited locations in Mexico where there's a specific species of fir tree. So what's happening to the monarch butterfly? So the population of this butterfly in the eastern population has been highly variable over the last 2 decades, but is showing long-term declines. So this graph shows 1994 to 2017, and the numbers are based on the annual monitoring of the size of their overwintering colonies in central Mexico. The population declined 84% between the winters of 1996 and 2014, and it's been said that the monarch butterfly faces a risk of extinction in the next 20 years. So looking at the potential threats and the reasons for this decline, they include climatic factors, habitat loss, specifically loss of milkweeds and the overwintering forest, disease, as well as agricultural insecticide use. This species is currently being reviewed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine if it needs Endangered Species Act protection. So again, the decline of the monarch butterfly isn't necessarily important from a commercial perspective. However, this species has remarkably high societal and cultural value. There are many opportunities for education, citizen science, and conservation. This is a very charismatic species, and we can get people excited about restoring habitat for it. And if we restore habitat for the monarch butterfly, we're also restoring habitat for other lesser known and less charismatic species. So it's not just pollinating insects that are facing decline. Insect populations as a whole are, and a few recent studies have been making headlines, like the ones I've shared here. In particular, this National Geographic headline is referencing a study from this January in the Journal of Biological Conservation that found that over 40% of insect species are threatened with extinction. And many folks will say, you know, we don't even need a scientific study to tell us that. We can use something that's known as the windshield phenomenon or the windshield test. So if you think back to 20 years ago or so, and I can remember this in my lifetime, that are, you know, especially driving at night, your windshield would just be splattered with dead insects. And, you know, while you still might have a few here and there, today it's certainly not the same that it was 20 years ago. This report in Biological Conservation found that habitat loss by conversion to intensive agriculture is one of the main drivers of insect declines, as well as the use of agricultural pesticides, invasive species, and climate change. So I wanted to share a quote from this study, and it said that a rethinking of our current agricultural practices, in particular a serious reduction in pesticide usage and its substitution with more sustainable, ecologically based practices, is urgently needed to slow or reverse current trends, allow the recovery of declining insect populations, and safeguard the vital ecosystem services that they provide. So we might think of pollinators and insects as the canary in the coal mine. So they're sending us a message about the way that we're treating the natural world, and we need to decide if we're going to listen and rethink the way that we're doing things. So here's another cartoon illustrating the need to raise awareness about declining bee and pollinator populations. The boy notices the bees missing from his Honey Nut Cheerios box, and he says, where did the bee go? And there is the bee as a missing person on the girl's milk carton, and it says, missing. Bees are disappearing worldwide. So with this recent research and news articles, cartoons coming out, we're finally beginning to see more of an awareness and an understanding of the problem, as well as need for rethinking of our current agricultural and food systems, and just looking for solutions to help solve this problem. So what are some of the solutions? What are the actions that we can take at home and in our society as a whole to help pollinators? So a big thing that we can do is at our homes, in our communities, on a large scale, we can use pollinator-friendly plants. Native plants especially tend to be a good choice because they're well suited to the pollinators that already live in this area, and they tend to be really hardy in the face of drought and other weather conditions. We can reduce or eliminate pesticide use in our landscapes in our community. If we are farmers, we can practice integrated pest management. We can reduce the areas that we mow in our backyards, on our roadsides, and this time of year, a good tip is we can limit the areas that we rake leaves, leave some areas behind for overwintering habitat for insects. We can support land conservation in our communities by helping to create and maintain community gardens and green spaces. And then this number 5, I should have probably put as number 1 because this is a huge part as it relates to our local food systems and our local farmers. Shopping local, knowing our farmer, knowing the practices that they're using on their land is one of the best things that I think we can do. Small, local, diversified farms tend to have farms that have weeds and bushes and just a diversity of habitats that is much better for these types of critters. Similarly, we can buy local honey. Number 6, we can support the work of groups that are promoting science-based practical efforts to help pollinators. And then finally, we can spread the word. And in particular, what we're going to kind of round out today's talk with is the Monticello Farmers Market has been hosting a pollination celebration, and I hope I can inspire folks to do similar activities in their community to help spread the word and raise awareness about these really neat and important critters. So the Pollinator Partnership is a nonprofit that wants to promote the health of pollinators. And one of the ways they do this is by promoting what's called National Pollinator Week. This is actually a week that was approved and designated by the US Senate about 12 years ago. It was designated as just a week in June, and it was marked as a necessary step to address the urgent issue of declining pollinator populations. Every year for the last several years, the Illinois governor has issued a proclamation designating a specific week, it's usually the 3rd week of June, as Illinois Pollinator Week. And so this is the proclamation from last year, shown here. The very first thing on the proclamation says, whereas pollinator species such as birds and insects are essential partners of farmers and ranchers in producing much of our food supply. The proclamation goes on to recognize the importance of pollinators to our native ecosystems and also recognizes our ability to take action to help these populations. So in 2018, the Monticello Farmers Market started our first community pollination celebration during Illinois Pollinator Week. It was a week-long event, and we invited community organizations and businesses to join us in creating the activities that happened that week. So it wasn't just the farmers market organizing things. We were encouraging other groups with shared missions to do something, and then we were kind of the ones that packaged it all together and presented it to the public as this week-long pollination celebration. So the goals of the pollination celebration were to, number 1, raise awareness about pollinator population decline and the role and importance of pollinators to our food system. To increase pollinator-friendly habitat, and we wanted to do that by planting 150 milkweed plants in the community. We wanted to increase other pollinator-friendly seed plantings, as well as decrease roadside mowing. Number 3, we wanted to build and strengthen the market's community partnerships, so working with other organizations and nonprofits in our community. And number 4, we wanted to celebrate our local farmers who use practices that benefit pollinators and are more consistent with a sustainable agriculture. And I think this point here kind of goes back to my very first slide when I asked the question, is our farmers market sustainable for another 20 years? And I think part of that is helping folks understand the importance of our local farmers and our local food systems and how they can help form a new, better, sustainable agriculture. So who were some of our partners or some example partners that folks can work with if they want to host similar events in their community? So we looked to local nonprofits and community organizations. So some of the ones we worked with were the U of I Extension. We worked both with staff at our local office as well as Master Gardener volunteers. These offices and these folks are not only, they're very knowledgeable, they have resources to share, and then the volunteers have time to share. We worked with our Soil and Water Conservation District, the local county office, along with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The Piatt County Farm Bureau was a participant in our pollination celebration. We have a Monticello area Arts Council that joined in, our local library, of course, our farmers and vendors that were selling at our market joined in. We had local restaurants, local businesses, and then also the city of Monticello participated. So how did we get the word out? You know, I'm an ecologist. I'm not a marketer or someone who does, you know, has a degree in this type of stuff. But because we had these relationships with other organizations, we kind of had help deciding how to get the word out. So we had a Facebook event. We had a little logo that was created, put together a press release that resulted in coverage in both the paper and on local TV. We did some Facebook Live videos. So if we were out and about doing a milkweed planting, we'd go live and tell folks where we were, what we were doing, and what the benefits were. We had a flyer that we hung around town. And then also we asked our organizational partners to put information up on their websites and put some email blasts out. So this is probably a little bit hard to read, but I just did want to show what our flyer looked like. So it was kind of busy, but the point of it was right off the bat, it shared the types of activities that were happening all week. And that included things like the milkweed sale and the goal to plant milkweeds. And then everything else, we had something on Tuesday, something on Wednesday. The farmers market had our pollination celebration on Thursday, and so on and so forth. So I'll now I have some pretty pictures and we'll go through and explain some of the fun stuff that we did. So we had a milkweed sale. We were able to get just flats of very small plants. And so this was actually something that I was in charge of, potting them up into bigger pots. And tending to them, and then bringing them to the market, and then some of the other events that we had going on during the week to sell. And one of the consequences of having 150 milkweed plants in your backyard is that you're going to end up with monarch caterpillars. So I think this year my sons and I raised over 40 caterpillars in our back porch, and then we were able to bring those caterpillars to the farmers market, not only the week of the celebration, but the next several weeks, and let kids get kind of a hands-on, up-close view of these amazing butterflies. And I would say that probably in most communities, there is several people who are doing this on their back porches or on their kitchen tables as a hobby, and many of them would probably love the opportunity to come out to the farmers market and bring a couple of caterpillars for people to check out. And you know, I said it was a great opportunity for kids to learn, but I would say just as many adults stop by to check it out and to talk about how they used to see so many monarchs when they were younger, and how that they're excited that there's more awareness about their populations now. So that Thursday, we kind of made the market our official pollination celebration at the market. The Farm Bureau was there to give away little packets of pollinator seeds. We sold our milkweed plants. We were sure to have our local farmer who has honey there that week. They had thought about bringing a demonstration beehive. It didn't work out because I think there was a chance of storms, but that would be a great thing to do. We had our local bakery highlight honey and different pollinator dependent fruits and some of the items that she sold that week. The Arts Council was there with an art activity. And then our master gardeners were there making seed bombs. So you mix compost and clay and seeds, so kids, adults alike, then could take that home and plant in their yards. We had some partner groups and volunteers do several milkweed and pollinator plantings the last 2 years. So our local forest preserve did a very small project around their flagpole. That's the top picture there. They had some native grasses, and we just stuck in some milkweed plants. There'd probably be even room for some other native plants that would benefit that area. The middle picture is a Monticello middle schooler They have a garden out behind the middle school that already has a diversity of native plants, but they had no milkweed. So we were able to simply provide them with a dozen milkweeds to diversify their garden. We planted some milkweeds along the city of Monticello's bike path. And then the last two projects here are kind of our bigger projects. The Monarch Brewing Company planted a pollinator pocket in 2018, and then this year there was a project at the Allerton Public Library. So another, I think, jewel of Monticello is our Monarch Brewing Company. It's just a few years old, restaurant, brewery, and an old revamped church. So they had at the northeast corner of their property this little gravel area, and the owners of the building, as well as some volunteers, came in, took the gravel out, brought in new soil, and planted pollinator-friendly vegetation as well as milkweeds. And then I have Pollinator Pocket there listed in quotations because they were able to register this habitat as an official pollinator pocket with the University of Illinois Extension. So I just wanted to put this in here as another resource. It's a place to go to get example plans like the one I included here. You can help plan your garden, get ideas for the best ways to plant it, and then you can certify your new garden. And these can be very small as an official pollinator pocket. So the website there takes you to this map to show you where the pockets are in the state and how you can certify yours. And then this year, we had Little Bluestem Montessori, which is a Montessori small school and group in our community, partnered with the Allerton Public Library. So it turned out the library was already planning on revamping their landscaping, but they weren't necessarily doing it with native plants and pollinators in mind. So they were happy to work with the owner of Little Bluestem Montessori to pick a section where we could have kind of a designated pollinator pocket. This one hasn't been officially certified yet through the extension, but it might be in the future. And you know, that library will be a great place to have educational opportunities around this habitat as it grows and changes through time. This is something that we did in 2018. This was cooperation between the University of Illinois Extension, Allerton Park, and then this Chris Benda is an Illinois botanist who came and led a native plant hike at Allerton. And then after the hike, we showed a documentary in the Allerton mansion known as A Landscape for Life. And this is a documentary by local filmmakers, so local to Central Illinois, I believe the Tuscola area, Kirby and Cindy Pringle. And so they were able to attend and share their process and reason for making this documentary. They have another documentary known as The Plight of the Monarch, and this is available, I believe, on YouTube. It's very short, informational, beautiful video. Another thing that we did was worked with our Soil and Water Conservation District to help promote their roadsides for wildlife signs, so letting people know that those signs were available and the benefits of putting them up and not mowing your roadsides. And then just this summer, so just June 2019, right as the Pollination Celebration was happening, this new guidance from the Illinois Monarch Project came out, Mowing on the Farm, Guidelines for Protecting Pollinators. So it gives guidance on backyard and roadside mowing, keeping pollinators in mind. This is something that Monarch Brewing Company did last year during Pollinator Week. They actually created a menu that highlighted pollinator-dependent crops. So using things like honey and fruits and vegetables and chocolate and other things. So that was really fun. I mentioned that our public library got involved. So they had their, this is June, you know, summertime, kids are out of school. They had their regular summer story hour. So it was easy enough for them to pick that week in June to celebrate pollinators at their story time or their story hour. So they had a beekeeper come talk to the kids about keeping bees, and then the kids did a pollinator art project. And then finally, I mentioned the Farmers Market is a program of Monticello Main Street. Our Monticello Main Street executive director both years planned what she called a pollinator play date, which was encouraging toddlers, preschoolers, young kids, again, it's in the summer, to come out, get together for a few hours, read some books about pollinators, maybe dress up with butterfly wings or put a flower in your hair, and just a way to get together with the community and celebrate pollinators. So I just want to throw out some inspiration of how might we all celebrate pollinators in 2020. I know that the Monticello Farmers Market is going to be watching for the date of the Illinois Pollinator Week, and we'll plan to do something similar in 2020. I think that it will probably be June 15th to 21st, but we'll be keeping an eye on this Pollinator Partnership website, and they'll actually post the proclamation from the governor to let us know when it officially is. They also have toolkits available on that website. You can add your Pollinator Week events to the map. I have start asking local partners now. Today, end of December might not be the best time, but certainly as we kick off the new year, planting the seed with your local farm bureau, your local soil and water conservation districts, and maybe they're the group to lead it in your community, but it's a good time to start having those conversations. And then I would add that it doesn't have to be complicated. There's very simple ways to start small, just by letting people know that it's Illinois Pollinator Week, highlighting the sale of honey and flowers that week. Just very simple steps to start and help inspire other people to get involved as well. So I wanted to thank everybody for being here to listen, and I just want to thank you, those who are farmers market managers that are listening. Our markets aren't possible without you. They're not possible with the people who vend, volunteer, and shop at our markets. But of course, none of it would be possible without pollinators. So I just wanted to wrap up and open the floor for not only questions, but happy to hear comments or ideas for next year's 2020 Pollination Celebration.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. Some great information here. I was really impressed. This is very good. What I'd like to do is to open up the microphones for everyone here that is attending to feel free and voice any questions you may have, or feel free to type them into the chat box at the bottom, and we will go from there. Now, I do have a question for you. You had all these beautiful milkweed plants ready for sale at the farmer's market. Where did you find the seeds for those?
So I was able to purchase the 3 flats. So I want to say maybe there's like 40 some plants in each flat. So I guess there'd be more than that if there was 150. Anyway, there's a native plant nursery in Southern Illinois known as Southern Wood Gardens. They sell at the Carbondale Farmers Market. So of course, from my Southern Illinois connections, I have an existing relationship with them. But they sell to other people as well. Again, Southern Wood Gardens. Checking with other groups like Central Illinois, we have Grand Prairie Friends that does a native plant sale. There's Illinois Native Plant Society chapters that do native plant sales. So partnering early with a group like that might be, you might be able to place an advance order for a flat of 100 plants or even 50 plants. I think another tip would be, maybe you have a farmer that sells at your farmer's market, that if you get with them early and say, the market would like to purchase 50 milkweed plants, is that something that you can provide? Or do you want to sell them? That's something I've thought for the future of this market is, suggesting that one of my vendors that does do plants, that they take it over. And then I don't have to tend to 150 milkweeds in my backyard.
That would be a little rough.
Yes.
All right. Let's see what we have here. Anybody have any questions that they want to mention here? I do have some coming in. Jerry did mention that a great presentation. He works with 5-year-olds on gardening, especially honeybees. Good for him. I also have a 4-H club on bees and pollination at the McHenry County Fairgrounds. He's working on a Kids and Bees program in Schaumburg, American Bee Federation. So it's a fee for kids, teachers, and parents, January 10th, Friday morning. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I know there's a lot of great stuff going on in the McHenry area, just environmental wise. So great to hear you're part of that.
So you also have another question concerning the seed bombs you were mentioning. Can you kind of go a little bit more into detail on that as to what that is? That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, I think the idea behind them, they end up being just these tiny little balls easily held in your hand. I think that they kind of started with this idea that you could take them and, throw them out your car window, into the roadside or an area where you wanted, important that they're native plants then. But I think that's kind of the idea behind it. But so it's a little bit of clay, and I'm actually sure that the University of Illinois Extension, like your local office, would have probably a recipe, or if you Googled it. But my understanding is it's a bit of clay and a bit of compost for nutrients, and then the seeds. So the seeds basically have everything they need to germinate right there in that little ball. And it's just a very easy way for someone to take it home and just stick it in an area. And then there might be something else in there that helps to hold water as well. So you get it kind of moist and stick it out there, and it's just kind of a guaranteed way to start some plants.
Lori, do you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. I had it turned off. Yeah, I'm a master gardener and University of Illinois, and also a master beekeeper at the University of Florida. So I've been trying to, in a small way, reach a lot of our kids. When I do presentations out there with adults and bees, bee clubs, I've done that. We're trying to recruit the American Bee Federation, which I'm a member. I also remind people that when I grew up in the 30s and 40s and the 50s, we believed 2 people for agriculture. And I do have farm property in Christian County and also Fayette County. Grew up in East Central Illinois. But we believed 2 people for growing. One was a local ag teacher, because we used to have seminars. 2, the University of Illinois agriculture extension agents. We don't have those anymore. So what we've got to do over the years, we have to recreate our thinking in farming and the way we grow things. We've gone way off. We believe the chemical companies too much today.
Okay.
So just a word of thought. If you got any questions, I'll be glad to share what I've been doing.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
We do have a question from Warren County, I believe it is. When is the best time to spray insecticides so they don't kill our pollinators?
I think suggest, again, talking to your local U of I extension offices to get some information and best practices. Of course, using insecticides as they're labeled is one very important thing. Another opportunity that I didn't mention is, there's plants out there that harbor populations of beneficial insects that, tend to kill pests. So looking into what is the pest you're trying to kill and what plants might harbor the predator to that pest is a good way to use integrated pest management and not have to use so many pesticides and insecticides. But as far as the timing of spraying, that's not actually expertise I have, unfortunately.
Generally on the
Why do you want to spray in the first place? What are you spraying for?
Okay.
Hurting beneficials.
Okay. So the other thing to keep in mind that is if you are going to spray, whether it is organic or any other type of chemicals, that you may want to read the label on the bottle. Generally they will have some instructions on there as well. I don't see any other questions at this time. Amanda, if you would go one more slide, I'd like to, there you go. The next winter webinar series that's coming up will be on January 13th, and we'll have a presentation on Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, as everybody knows it. which is the produce rule, and we're going to talk about how it relates to farmers markets. Is it required? And what some of the farmers market managers and the vendors themselves need to start thinking about. And then in February, we're going to have a look at chef demos at the market. And in March, we're going to have the future of farmers markets on building collaborative practices. So we hope to see most of you then. Right now, I'd like to thank Amanda from the Monticello Farmers Market for the great presentation and sharing your expertise with us today. Really good information. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and are able to use this information for your next growing season. Thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.